shooting. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ryan Backmann, founder and executive director of Project Cold Case. Lorena Inclan,
Hey,
Action
everybody.
News.
Good to be back.
Thank you for coming and joining us again today, Lorena. You know, we do these occasionally, try to do them monthly with you, go back and look through some of the old cases that you've spotlighted with your station and the families that you've talked to. Today we're going to talk about Booker Williams.
Yep.
You featured this case back in May 2018.
Yep.
So,
And this is a 1983 case.
1983, 26-year-old Booker Williams found stabbed to death in his car, right on the grounds of an elementary school.
Yeah, that now has been renamed Grand Park Education Center, but back then it was Grand Park Elementary School. It was. This was a really interesting case because of all the information we were able to get from JSO. And because they did have a person of interest, and then they also told us, and you'll see here shortly, about somebody who confessed to allegedly confessed to the murder.
Yes.
Who was not the person of interest, it was somebody else.
So let's watch your segment because that'll allow people to catch up, and then we can talk more specifically about it.
That's all I see when I look over there. It's more questions.
We met with Terrence Williams just outside the Grand Park Education Center. The area has changed a lot since May 3rd, 1983, the day his uncle's body was found in an open field by the school.
I never got a chance to say goodbye. It really affected my family deeply. It changed everybody.
JSO showed us these photos of the 1978 Chevy Monza found in the field. 26-year-old Booker Williams' lifeless body was in the driver's seat. He had been repeatedly stabbed.
Whoever did it had a lot of anger in them to stab somebody that many times.
I'm standing near the crime scene right now at the end of Almeida Street. The car was found just over here in that area, just feet away from what was then Grand Park Elementary School and is still an education center today. This happened on a weekday, which means a student could have found this scene. But JSO tells me a worker made the discovery and called 911.
There was a knife outside the vehicle stuck in the ground on that passenger side where that door was open.
But Sergeant Dan Jansen says testing on the knife came back negative for traces of blood. Through the years, one man was considered a person of interest, but he recently died. But there's also an anonymous call in the early days of the investigation that alleged a teenager named Jimmy may have been the killer.
He advised that he asked Jimmy about it, and Jimmy showed him a knife and told him that he had killed the guy.
No DNA testing was ever done on the case. Detectives hope to find something that can be tested. Meanwhile, Williams has made it his mission to never stop looking for answers.
What I have is a lot of hope that someone will be facing justice for this.
Lorena Inclan, CBS 47, Action News Jax.
All right. So we were just kind of reminiscing while that was playing about Terrence, who was Booker's nephew that you interviewed there. Unfortunately, we've lost contact with him. The phone number we had for him is no longer good. But we were talking about, you know, how great an interview he was, how he would come in here to the office. He brought all those pictures that you saw, that you used in your spot. And he would come to support meetings, and he was a real champion for his uncle's murder. And
he was 12 when it happened, but he was really close to his uncle. I mean, you know, we were talking about how everybody has a favorite family member, right? Your favorite cousin, your favorite uncle, aunt, you know? And Booker was definitely Terrence's favorite uncle.
Well, and I think, like, remember yourself at 12, how impressionable you are, and how if there is that favorite uncle, and then they're killed or they die, and then it's, in this situation where they were killed and it's unsolved, that just sticks with you. This is one of those cases we've talked about in the past. Booker was 26. We're going on 37 years since he's been killed. So he's been gone longer than he actually was alive.
That's right.
And it's why it's so important that we keep pushing these stories out there into the public eye, because as his relatives get older, when Terrence, grows old, who's going to be out there fighting for Booker? You know what I mean?
Exactly, yeah. And he wanted to carry the torch and I really encourage everybody to go to the podcast, because there's so much more information that unfortunately I couldn't put on the TV story. But he talks about how he's sort of carrying the torch for his family, because he promised his grandparents, who were Booker's parents, that he was going to keep fighting and try to find answers.
Yeah, and he did, and he has, and I'm sure he hasn't stopped just because we haven't talked to him in a few months. Right. But when we tried to call him and let him know we were going to do this Facebook Live, we couldn't get in touch with him. But
hopefully somebody watching knows him and can share it with him.
Yeah, and I think he used to do some stuff on social media, so maybe he'll stumble across it and realize that that's why we haven't talked to him, since we don't have his new phone number. But anyway, back to to Booker's case. His body, as you said in the story, is in his car on the property of an elementary school.
Right.
Kind of off in the wood line.
Yeah, sort of like behind it.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no. Behind it were kind of not that many kids, I guess, would go there unless there's like a shortcut type of thing. But it was definitely, right by this school in a wooded area. And as you saw in the story, I kind of showed people where it kind of looked like that back then. A little bit more grass and stuff.
Yeah, you saw some of the old pictures that JSO shared with the car parked over there. The passenger door was open. Booker was deceased in the driver's seat. He had been stabbed
multiple times.
JSO kind of said multiple times.
Yeah. They wouldn't
Terrence
say how
many. Said, he mentioned a number that was close to 30, I think, in the series, in the segment. We couldn't confirm that. JSO wouldn't confirm that at the time. That's obviously something that very few people know. Exactly how many.
But it was definitely a personal attack.
But it was definitely a personal attack. He was definitely stabbed a number of times. A weird thing, the door was open, passenger door was open, and there was a knife stuck in the ground right outside the passenger side. Yeah. At the time that you did the interview with Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, they had not pulled all the evidence out of the property room. They did know that knife had been tested for blood and fingerprints early on in the but you got to remember that back in 1983 DNA was not a thing, so they weren't testing for DNA back then. They explained to you that their goal was then to go to the property room, pull all the evidence, and see, check the knife, see if it could be tested, meet with Florida Department of Law Enforcement with the evidence that was still available, and see what could be retested, along with losing, Terrence's contact information. The sheriff's office has had some turnover, and we don't know what of that stuff was done. We don't know if that evidence was retested. If the evidence
some things
could
came back
retested.
Negative though, and they were trying to find blood.
Excuse me, I think the knife in the ground came back with no blood,
which was very odd.
And I remember the cold case sergeant saying like we're not sure that's the murder weapon,
right? Because how could somebody who was stabbed that many times?
Yeah.
But it is something of note, because a knife stuck in the dirt right outside of the passenger side door
where a person had just been stabbed.
And you presume that that's where the suspect left through as well.
And that brings, and you said it already, the podcast for this one had a lot of really good information that you just couldn't squeeze all in. But part of that information was two persons of interest. And I think this is interesting because if I tell you the story of one of these persons of interest, you're going to say, that's the guy.
Yep, exactly.
And if you tell the story of the other person of interest, you're going to say, that's the guy.
Yeah, so,
and they're not connected. You know what I mean? So it kind of shines a light on the investigative process and how difficult this
Absolutely.
is.
Absolutely.
There was an individual that was last seen with Booker. They go out, they go to the club, they are partying it up.
He was seen walking around with a knife,
the
next day.
Or the day before.
The next day, I think it was.
He had a knife. He was seen with a knife. He's hanging out with Booker. The family didn't say this, but the detective or the sergeant said in the piece that there was some notes in the report that this person of interest and Booker may have had a romantic relationship.
Right.
Nobody, obviously you can't ask Booker what his preferences were, but the person of interest came in, sat down, did an interview with homicide detectives, claimed that he used to be gay. He had a girlfriend. He wasn't.
Now he had
anymore.
a girlfriend and wasn't
anymore.
That's what he told detectives.
That's what he told detectives. That's in the report. And then there were people that said that individual was a very jealous individual too. So we know that those two were together that evening.
He was the last person seen with Booker.
The last person seen with him. We know that he was carrying around a knife. He was reported to be jealous. So there were a lot of things that pointed at him.
Right.
And
it sounds like he had some sort of motive.
Right.
Unfortunately, though,
he's passed away.
Right.
And
he was a person of interest at the time.
He was.
Never officially a suspect.
Right. And I think the reason he wasn't, suspect number one, because all of that certainly points to him being, could have been a suspect, was that the day Booker's body is found, a phone call comes in to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Homicide Department and says, I saw Jimmy.
A teenager named Jimmy.
A
17-year-old named Jimmy. Yeah.
Get out of the car and run away.
And run away, had a knife, and said, I killed the guy.
Right. And the caller said, when I asked him why he was running from the car, he showed me a knife and said, I just killed the guy.
Right. Kind of takes a completely different turn, this case.
And then also in that description was that Jimmy lived in a house
on the same street.
The dead ended at where the school was, and where the
which
field
is
was.
Almeida Street.
Right.
And he lived in a home described as a yellow home. On Almeida Street, was just so happens where the crime scene was, where the body was found. However, how many Jimmys are there in Jacksonville and in that area of town? I mean, it's no last name.
No last name.
Just this
a
witness
very
account.
Vague description.
Very vague description. So now, as a detective, I can't imagine how complicated this must have been at the time, because I'm sure that detectives at the time pretty much thought that the other person was a person of interest, and they were gonna figure out if anybody else saw him or anything like that. But then you get this phone call, and what do you do?
Now you have two very good suspects.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so I don't know. To me, it was interesting to listen to the podcast, because the sergeant goes into a whole lot of information that shows the complexities of investigating
and solving
these cases. And now, fast forward 30 plus years to when they were taking a look at it back in 2018, and nobody has any idea who Jimmy is, or if Jimmy's still around. The first person of interest is deceased. They've confirmed that he passed away.
Can't talk to him anymore.
So you can't talk to him. Jimmy lives in a yellow house that has probably been painted, if it's still there.
If it's still there.
So it just very complex,
Very complex case, and you mentioned if it's still there, and I remember going to that area when we were doing the story, and there were some businesses there now. There was a industrial type of looking business there. Yeah. So the home might not even be there at all, Let alone, the people who knew him, maybe the family members, friends, or anything who might remember a Jimmy from the 80s. It's so complex. That's why the DNA part of this is what really, I believe, could solve this case.
Yeah, that's why, hopefully, like I said, we haven't been able to confirm whether that evidence was actually looked at and retested, whether it could be retested.
Right.
There are situations where back in the 80s, they may have done something to that knife that then doesn't allow for DNA testing to happen now. Maybe it contaminated whatever blood there was, if there was. The sergeant mentions in the podcast that they hadn't gone and seen the knife, but depending on how that knife is put together, maybe they can take it apart. Maybe there was
there's
blood.
some stuff there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you never know if it was cleaned. Anything could have happened.
Yeah, exactly. That's something that I would really like to find out. Is what was done with that evidence. But
definitely worth a follow-up for sure. And on all of these cases, a lot of them did have DNA, and unfortunately, budgeting and things like that prevent a lot of DNA from getting tested. And there's a big backlog.
Yeah, there's lots of reasons why things, and sometimes if things have already been tested once, they know that there's either not enough, or that it's contaminated, and that even though technology has advanced, it hasn't advanced enough to justify resubmitting. Because the last thing you don't want to use up, if you've only got a little bit of a sample, you don't want to use that up if you know the technology is not quite there yet.
And Ryan, more or less like the price point, at least for the private labs, it's expensive.
Yeah. It can be very expensive. I mean, depending on, because you have to think about this too. How many pieces of evidence do you have? You know what I mean? What is the best piece of evidence to test? Are you going to send a shirt, or are they just going to take one sample from one spot? You know what I mean? So there's
people don't think about that.
Yeah,
it's like here's all the evidence. No, you have to figure out what will be the best lead for you.
Exactly, and a lot of times the detectives will sit down with the state lab or with a private lab and go through the evidence and kind of prioritize and say let's do these three and let's see what we get. We feel like these are our best chance, these 3 items or these 3 locations.
And it could be in the thousands of dollars.
And it could be in the thousands of dollars. And it could come bact nothing.
Right.
So there's a lot involved in it, a lot associated with it. But let's scroll through some of those pictures while we keep talking.
Everybody recognizes him because Booker was a really social person. He liked to go out. He liked to have a good time. People in the 80s, remember back then. I mean, I'm sure it was a good time.
I know in the podcast, the sergeant names the club that they went to.
OP Club.
OP Club. Yeah. I couldn't remember what it was, but look at him.
He liked to have a good time.
Yeah, they were obviously interested in hanging out. We don't know who all is in those photos with them, but or I don't remember.
Right. Yeah, and this is him right here. It was also said that there may have been some sort of gathering there in that wooded area.
Yeah, you got the feeling that that was just kind of the spot that people would go.
Right.
After the clubs closed,
the after party?
The after party, and that they would just go, maybe drink and hang out, and right there. Again, there was in the report was that there may have been a romantic relationship, but we weren't, could never confirm that, one way or the other. So you don't know if it was a jealous relationship or if it was a situation where. One person tried to hit on the other and the other was not reciprocal.
Not receptive of that. Yeah.
And it got violent. We don't know if there was an argument that had nothing to do with that.
And the other possibility is that there could have been more than 2 people in the car.
Yeah, the detective
because that's something we talked about. Yeah.
And obviously, that's So we talked about like the physical evidence part of it. That being able to go back and retest some of that evidence. The other thing that could solve the case is if the person that called and talked about Jimmy back then is still alive and could come forward again now until maybe he does know Jimmy's last name.
Right.
Maybe he learned Jimmy's last name.
I hope that person is watching.
Yeah. Maybe maybe that was the original suspect. Who knows?
Who knows?
That he called it in himself.
Relationships could have changed.
But the relationships could change, and you've got the tip number right there for Crime Stoppers, 866-845-TIPS, $3,000 reward. If the other person of interest, if he ever he's not alive anymore, but if he ever confided in someone, it's still important to come forward with that information. Obviously, it doesn't lead to an arrest. It's not going to lead to a conviction. Right. It's not going to lead to a $3,000 reward because there's no arrest. But the family will know.
It could clear the case.
And the case will be cleared.
And solved, And the answers portion of this is the big deal. When we were speaking to Terrence, the nephew, he mentioned the Freddie Farrah case.
Yeah, that's right.
And that caught my attention too, because it gives families so much hope. That case alone gave families so much hope.
I think that's the reason why they called law enforcement.
Absolutely.
I think, Terrence said, like, we started seeing all this information on this 43-year-old case that was solved, and we thought, why not our case?
A much older case than Booker's case. Yeah.
And so they reached out to law enforcement, asked a few questions, were referred to us. We obviously helped facilitate getting it on your station. And, and again, there's multiple ways that this case could potentially be solved.
Right.
There's no reason to give up hope, just because we're reaching 37 years. We just, the sooner the better, because if that, if the person that did this is still alive, then it's important that they be held accountable for their actions.
Or if the person who knows who did this is still alive, maybe they had a conversation.
Right.
This was a really violent crime. Yeah. I mean, it was not a shooting; it was a stabbing. It was a lot of
close
effort.
Contact. It was
and multiple stab wounds. That person, you can imagine. I'm sure after that happened, there was some sort of a struggle, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that person didn't look completely normal afterwards. I mean, there was blood everywhere.
Not with that kind of a violent attack.
Mm-hmm.
And this also is an opportunity to highlight something that you pointed out in the podcast, which is, and the sergeant talked about, the car. If that crime happened today, that car would still be, if it happened 3 years ago, that car would still be in JSO's possession.
Right.
It would be swabbed from top to bottom, left to right. 1983, nobody knew that DNA would be the thing that could solve the case, and that there may be a speck of blood in that car that is the, what solves it. So JSO doesn't have the car.
Unfortunately, they don't have the car. Things were just done differently back then.
It was, and not by fault.
Not right. It was just, that was their standard way of doing things. Unfortunately, I wish they, hindsight as helping us here.
Yeah.
I wish they would have known, that is, I mean, that it's in itself, that's where the crime happened, in that car.
Yeah. You really had a tight crime scene.
Right, exactly.
And now things would have been done so different, but it's important to remember, because a lot of times people ask questions. We had one, we did a recap Friday on social media, and there's a 5-year-old girl that was abducted in California, and her remains were found a few months later. And the story basically said she was walking home from a friend's house, and somebody commented and said, why would a 5-year-old be walking, home alone? And it was 1963. You know what I mean? It was
then.
Different, and it wasn't quite as walking home alone. Like, she was walking home with a friend, and then the friend peeled off, and so there.
Right.
But you have to be careful when you jump to conclusions and make assumptions. They didn't keep the car. Not because they knew one day that car could be valuable evidence. Right. They didn't keep the car because where do you keep a car for 37 years?
Right, exactly. And also there was no crystal ball where, in 10 years there's going to be a DNA. No, they had no idea that even, first of all, it didn't exist at all. No, yeah. So to them at that point, why keep it if it doesn't exist, Yeah. Unfortunately, it would have been good if somebody was like, wait, maybe,
Yeah, if somebody, if they would have said, well, there's a little room in the back of the lot. Let's just put it there for a while. But I'm sure, that the testing that crime scene technicians did and that detectives did in 1983, I'm sure they did everything that was available to them at that time with that car.
Right.
And it, you know what I mean? And it didn't produce anything.
It didn't produce anything,
back then, and now it's not available. So, there was other evidence. They talked about that knife. So
that, I think, could lead to a lot of other things. I mean, because that is just so, it's not a random thing.
Yeah.
There's a reason why that knife was there. How did it get there? So, and I'm glad that JSO still has that.
Yeah.
In their possession. So there could be answers to this case for sure. It's just a matter of being able to test some of these things.
Absolutely. And I think as we're talking, things come to my head, and I think about, I haven't called this person,
right?
And and let them know. And I've got a meeting in Clearwater next week with the Cold Case Advisory Commission. That's the Florida Sheriff's Association, and there's somebody that's going to be attending that meeting that might be able to look at this case
that would be awesome.
And help. And so I just need to make myself a note so I don't forget when I'm there Tuesday or Wednesday next week to make sure to bring this up to them, because it's somebody local that will be down there, and we might be able to help with that too. So that's why we do this, to just try to remind other people, but also as we you and I both sit down, we watch the segment that you did, rewatch it, we listen to the podcast over again, we catch new things,
it's good to go back and be like, oh, let me follow up on that, there's a lot still that can be done in this case and all the cases that we've covered. But the biggest thing, DNA is obviously a huge tool, and it's solving so many cases. But I think that we can't underestimate the power of the public coming forward and somebody picking up the phone and calling. That could be the root of solving so many cases. And in this case, I mean, a lot of people knew Booker. Yeah. He was really social. He had a lot of friends. He liked to go out. I mean, maybe some of you watching remember going out with him and partying with him.
Yeah, maybe saw him that night at the OP Club. And I think
this was May 3rd, 1983.
His body was found May 3rd, and I think May 2nd was kind of he was out partying that night.
Between May 2nd and May 3rd, the crime happened.
Yeah, and so again, if you knew something back then, but for whatever reason didn't come forward or were scared to come forward, now's a new opportunity, 36 and a half years later to do that.
Get that off your chest.
Yeah, get that off your chest. And maybe, again, bring answers to a family, even if, that the suspect has passed away and is no longer alive and can't be arrested and prosecuted. For the sheriff's office to be able to clear the case, to be able to sit down with the family and go
tell them
through
this
that.
person did it and here's why.
Yeah, and here's how
that's
we know that.
huge. Even if that person is not in jail, I mean, that's huge.
Absolutely.
And Terrence said, if that person is dead and no longer, has passed away, then that's between him and his maker.
That's
so right. and for families to know that, whatever the case is, that person may, pay for it in some way, So for Terrence, that's and his whole family, that's very important, even if that person's dead.
Absolutely. You hope that if justice isn't served here on this earth, that it will be somehow, some way, and that people have to answer for their crimes and for hurting other people. So with that being said, Lorena, thank you again for coming and joining us. This was the Booker Williams case here in Jacksonville, Florida, May 3rd, 1983. If you have any information on that, please call Crime Stoppers. 866-845-TIPS, $3,000 reward.
And if you want to watch the full story again and also listen to the podcast, you could just Google Booker Williams Action News Jax, and it'll come up, and right embedded in that web story, you'll see the link for the podcast. It's very lengthy, a lot more information in there. Absolutely. And hopefully you can listen to it.
Yeah, it has the full interview with Terrence. It has the full interview with Sergeant Jansen, and then even some of me on there in an interview. So, well, thank you again, Lorena. This is great information. Hopefully somebody out there watching will be able to do something with this information. And the next time we talk about Booker Williams, it would be great if we were talking about a solved case.
Resolution. And I'm hopeful that one day I'll be sitting here and talk about a case that's been solved.
It's coming.
Yes,
one day.
Absolutely.
All right. Here's our remembrances. Please like our Facebook page, share this information, make sure that people out there have the opportunity to see it. And hopefully we'll reach that one person. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next week.
News.